The trauma bay went silent the moment the Admiral's bloody hand rose from the gurney and pointed, not at the chief surgeon, not at the attending physician, not at the military escort standing rigid against the wall, but at the small, quiet nurse in the corner who'd been trying to make herself invisible for the past 4 years. His voice was barely a breath, barely human. Nightfall. One word. 7 letters. And every person in that room stopped breathing at exactly the same moment, because the nurse he was pointing at, the one Dr. Marcus Rowe had called a background fixture just 3 hours earlier, went completely, dangerously still. If this story already has you leaning forward, follow along and don't let go. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The rain had been coming down sideways since Tuesday. Port Carver, Oregon existed in the kind of perpetual gray that outsiders described as atmospheric and locals described as exhausting. A mid-sized coastal city wedged between the Pacific and a ridge of dark fir trees that blocked the sky from October through March. The harbor still moved fishing boats and container ships. The downtown still had a decent diner on every other block. But the hospital, Aldermore Medical Center, was the city's real anchor, the place that kept 3 counties alive when winter storms cut the roads and nobody could get to Portland. Mara Weston had worked the ER at Aldermore for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She knew the count because she'd arrived on a specific date for specific reasons she didn't think about if she could help it. And keeping count was the kind of thing she'd learned to do without deciding to, a leftover habit from a life she wasn't supposed to be living anymore. She was not remarkable to look at. Medium height, medium build, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that was always slightly off-center because she did it by feel in the dark of her studio apartment at 5 in the morning. She wore scrubs in navy blue because they showed blood less dramatically than the standard issue teal, and she carried a pen in her left breast pocket even though she was right-handed, and she moved through the ER in a way that nurses with 20 years of experience moved, economical, quiet, low center of gravity, aware of everything without appearing to look at anything. She was 34 years old. She looked, to everyone at Aldermore who'd bothered to form an opinion, like exactly what she'd presented herself as. A competent but unambitious ER nurse who'd probably peaked in her early career, wasn't trying to advance, and was content to show up, do her work, and go home. Dr. Marcus Rowe had a different word for it. Several, actually. Weston. He said her name the way someone might say the name of a piece of furniture, acknowledging its existence without caring about it. He was standing at the nurse's station with a chart in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, which was how he stood approximately 60% of the time she'd known him. Tall, broad-shouldered, aggressively confident in the way of men who had been told they were exceptional for long enough that they'd stopped questioning it. He'd trained at Johns Hopkins. He mentioned it roughly once a week. Mara looked up from the IV line she was checking. That BP cuff in Bay 4. He didn't look at her when he said it. Swap it out. It's reading high, and I need accurate numbers before I discharge. I swapped it 40 minutes ago, she said. The reading is accurate. Mr. Aldridge has new onset hypertension. His chart notes haven't been updated since last visit. Rowe looked at her for approximately 1 second. Then he looked at the second-year resident standing nearby, a young man named Torres, who had the deer-in-headlights expression of someone who'd been awake for 22 hours. Swap the cuff, Rowe repeated to the room in general, and walked away. Torres looked at Mara. Mara looked at the IV line. She finished what she was doing, walked to Bay 4, did not swap the cuff, and instead pulled up Mr. Aldridge's records on the room terminal to confirm what she'd already confirmed, and then quietly added a note flagging the discrepancy in the history. Aldridge, a 67-year-old retired teacher with hands like dinner plates and a disposition that reminded Mara of her father, watched her type. "You gonna get in trouble for that?" he asked. "Probably not," she said. Which was true. Rowe never noticed what she did or didn't do as long as it didn't require him to directly interact with her again. That was, in fact, the most functional dynamic she'd been able to establish in this place. "You're smarter than you let on," Aldridge said. Mara gave him the look she gave everyone who said things like that. A brief, closed smile that wasn't unfriendly, just non-committal, and went back to work. The shift ran the way. Tuesday shifts in November ran, relentless and unglamorous. 2 cardiac events before noon, a compound fracture from a logging accident, a teenager who'd taken something at a party and whose pupils were going in separate directions, a woman in her 70s with abdominal pain that Mara flagged twice as likely appendicitis before anyone ran the CT, and which turned out to be exactly that. She didn't say anything when they wheeled the woman toward surgery. There was no point. The ER at Aldermore had a rhythm to it, and Mara had learned it the way she'd learned every other rhythm she'd ever needed to learn, completely, and without anyone knowing she had. She knew which attending had the shortest response time and which ones needed 2 pages before they answered. She knew which orderly took the patient transport routes that added 4 minutes, but avoided the elevator backup near radiology. She knew the supply closet on the 3rd floor had a backup pulse ox that nobody had logged because the last inventory had been done before the renovation, and that it had saved 2 patients from delayed care in the 18 months since she'd noticed it was there. She knew these things because she paid attention to them. She paid attention because that was what she did, what she'd always done, in one form or another. She did not think about the other form very often. At 4:15 in the afternoon, a nurse named Deb Ferris materialized at Mara's elbow with the specific energy of someone carrying gossip they'd been holding too long. "Military transport coming in," Deb said. "ETA 20 minutes. Nobody will say what exactly. Security people called ahead. They're locking down Bay 1 and 2. Mara was charting. "Trauma?" "Gunshot, they're saying. High profile." Deb lowered her voice even though they were standing beside a broom closet. "There's a Navy designation in the advance notice, like official Navy, the kind that gets its own paperwork category." Mara saved her chart. "What's Roe doing?" "Gearing up like it's his personal Super Bowl." Deb made a face that summarized several years of professional frustration in a single expression. "Trauma team's already staged. He told me, and I want you to really appreciate this, that he didn't need extra personnel cluttering the bay. So we're watching from outside." "We're watching from outside," Deb paused. "You don't look surprised." Mara wasn't. She'd been excluded from high-profile cases before. Not officially, never with any language that could be documented, but Roe had a habit of staging his trauma team in ways that left certain people on the perimeter. She'd learned to stop pushing on those perimeters. "I'll keep my board clear," Mara said, "in case overflow comes." Deb nodded and drifted back toward the station. Mara glanced at the clock, 4:17, and finished her charting. The convoy arrived at 4:38. 3 black vehicles plus an ambulance, moving in a tight configuration that didn't belong to any civilian protocol Mara had ever seen. The ambulance was modified, military grade, she noticed from the window, running different chassis modifications than standard. The escorts who came through the ambulance bay doors moved like people who expected the geometry of every room before they entered it, which was its own kind of language if you knew how to read it. She wasn't supposed to be near Bay 1. She had no assigned role in whatever was about to happen. She was standing at the edge of the main corridor near the supply alcove, technically within her normal zone, not technically in the trauma staging area, and she stayed very still. The gurney came through fast. Male patient, she assessed in the first 2 seconds. Late 60s. Broad-framed but recently thinner, the kind of weight loss that happens to people after extended operational stress or illness. He was gray in the face, not the gray of simple blood loss, but the gray of someone who had been managing severe pain long enough that the body had started making decisions about what it was going to prioritize. His left side. He was conscious. That was notable. For the level of distress he was presenting, conscious was not expected. His eyes moved. Most trauma patients arriving at that acuity level had eyes that were doing one of 2 things, fixed on something far away or closed entirely. His were neither. They were scanning, systematically, the way you scanned when you had been trained to always know what room you were in. They swept across the corridor and found her. For exactly half a second, they stopped. Then the gurney was past her, through the bay doors, and Roe's voice was already rising over the organized chaos of the trauma team staging. Mara stood very still for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked to the nurse's station and pulled up the patient intake form that had just been generated, which had a name and an institutional designation and very little else because the fields that would normally contain medical history had been redacted, which wasn't something she'd ever seen before in 4 years at this hospital. The name read, Admiral Varden T. Kessler, USN, returned. She put the form down and went back to her board. For the next 40 minutes, Aldermore ran 2 hospitals simultaneously. In Bay 1, Rowe and his team worked on the Admiral. In the rest of the ER, the regular Tuesday afternoon kept moving. Lacerations and chest pains in a woman with a dislocated shoulder who was considerably calmer about it than anyone expected. Mara worked her board. She started an IV line, checked labs, talked a young father through the process of watching his daughter get stitches in her chin after a fall from the monkey bars. The girl was 7 and more interested in the color of the suture thread than in crying, which Mara found entirely reasonable. She kept her back to Bay 1. She'd been keeping her back to a lot of things for 4 years. At 5:22, she heard the change in the noise level. Not louder, different. The specific quality of controlled urgency shifting into uncontrolled urgency. She knew the sound the way she knew the difference between a cardiac monitor's normal beeping and the sound it made when the rhythm broke into something that was going to kill someone in the next 4 minutes. She turned. Through the bay window. Bay 1 had an interior window, standard design for observation, which Rowe usually kept screened but which someone had apparently forgotten to close. She could see the room, and she could see that something had changed. The monitor readings were wrong. Not wrong in the way that meant equipment error. Wrong in the way that meant the patient's pressure was collapsing faster than the team had anticipated, and the intervention they'd set up wasn't catching it. Mara looked at the monitor numbers for 3 seconds. She recognized what she was looking at. It wasn't on the obvious list. Not the things you checked first for a gunshot patient, not the hemorrhagic indicators that Rowe would be tracking, not the things that showed up clearly on the initial assessment. It was a secondary pattern, something that presented the same way as standard pressure dysregulation until you'd seen it fail 6 times in very specific operational contexts, and then it never looked like anything else ever again. She was already moving before she'd finished the thought. She wasn't supposed to be in that room. She went through the bay doors anyway. The room was tight with people. Rowe and his resident, 2 scrub nurses, an anesthesiologist, 2 of the military escorts standing against the far wall in the postures of people who were not medically trained but were extremely unhappy about what they were watching. Rowe clocked her immediately. Weston. His voice had the temperature of something left in a freezer. What are you doing in here? You have a tension pattern that isn't responding to standard drainage protocol because the entry vector is anterior, not lateral. She was already at the bedside, looking at the monitor, looking at the patient. You need to change the approach before the next 30 seconds, or you're going to lose him. The room did one of those things that rooms do sometimes in high-stakes moments. The noise level didn't drop exactly, but it changed quality. Rowe stared at her. Get out, he said. Dr. Rowe, get out of my trauma bay. Admiral Kessler's hand moved. It moved from where it had been lying at his side, restrained, which was protocol, but loosely. And it came up and it found Mara's wrist. His grip was weak. He was losing blood pressure by the second. But his eyes were open, and they were on her face, and they were not the eyes of a man who was confused. Nightfall, he said. The word was barely audible. His lips barely moved. The 2 military escorts against the wall went absolutely rigid. The room froze. Rowe said, What? Not as a question, more as the reflexive sound of someone who hadn't understood something and wasn't sure they wanted to. Admiral Kessler's eyes stayed on Mara's face. His hand stayed on her wrist. I want... He stopped, breathed, the breath wrong, and wet and shallow. Operator Nightfall, Protocol 7. His eyes closed for a second. Opened again. Only her. One of the military escorts, to the one on the left, who was taller and had the bearing of someone who gave orders rather than received them, took 2 steps away from the wall. Ma'am, his voice was controlled. If you're who the Admiral says you are, you need to work fast. Mara looked at Kessler's face, at the monitor. At the entry wound she could now confirm, without any remaining doubt, was positioned exactly the way she'd identified it from outside the window. She looked at Rowe, who was standing with his mouth slightly open and the chart in his hand and 4 years of professional certainty falling off him in chunks. She said, I need you to step back. He didn't move. Dr. Rowe, her voice was entirely level, step back or you're going to watch him die. It was the military escort who made the decision. He put his hand on Rowe's arm, not forcefully, not roughly, but with the specific body language of someone ending an argument. and Rose stepped back, and Mara was already reaching for the supply tray. What happened in the next 7 minutes was not smooth. Real emergency intervention never is. There were 2 wrong reaches for supplies because she hadn't used this layout in 4 years, and her muscle memory was calibrated for different rooms with different configurations. There was a moment when the monitor screamed and she felt, not panic, not quite, but the specific ice-cold focus that is what panic becomes when you've been trained to metabolize it. And she adjusted her hands and changed the angle and kept moving. She talked through what she was doing, not because anyone needed to hear it, but because verbal confirmation was a habit that had saved lives in conditions where communication was the only safety net, and she wasn't about to drop it now. The anesthesiologist started responding to her narration without any discussion, just picked up the thread and ran with it, which was how it worked when 2 people in a room both knew what they were doing and had the sense to recognize it in each other. At the 6-minute mark, the pressure reading stopped falling. At the 7-minute mark, it started, cautiously, to climb. Mara stood back. Her hands were steady. Her scrubs had blood on them in a pattern that was already telling the room a story she hadn't intended to tell. The anesthesiologist said quietly, "Good call." She didn't answer. She looked at Admiral Kessler. His color was already marginally better. Not good, not safe, nowhere near stable. But the specific gray of someone whose body had been shutting itself down by increments had shifted, barely, toward something less final. His eyes found hers. He didn't speak. He didn't have the breath for it. But something in his face, the specific way a person's face looks when they have been very close to a door they couldn't open from the other side and have just stepped back from it, said everything he would have said if he could. The taller military escort was on a phone. She could hear the clipped technical language of someone reporting up a chain. She caught fragments, confirmed, and Aldermore Medical, and one word, repeated twice, that she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 4 years. Nightfall. Rowe was standing at the edge of the room. He looked like a man who had just watched a building he was sure he owned turn out to belong to someone else entirely. "What," he said, to no one in particular, "just happened?" The escort lowered his phone. He looked at Mara with an expression that mixed relief and something more complicated. Recognition, maybe, or the specific discomfort of people who had been looking for something for a long time and weren't entirely sure how to act now that they'd found it. "We need to secure this room," he said, "and we need to talk." "Later," Mara said. She was already checking the line. The pressure was holding, fragile but holding, and that mattered more right now than whatever conversation was about to happen. "Give me 10 minutes. She worked. The room reformed around her, some people leaving, the anesthesiologist staying, the escort making calls in the corner. Rowe didn't leave. He stood where he'd stepped back to, and he watched her work. And she felt his gaze, but she didn't look at him because there was nothing useful in that direction right now. Deb appeared in the doorway at some point, face unreadable, and then disappeared again. At the 11-minute mark, Kessler's pressure had stabilized enough to take him off the immediate edge. Not safe. But no longer in the next 5 minutes territory. The anesthesiologist adjusted the drip, made a note, glanced at Mara with the expression of a professional acknowledging work done. Mara stepped back from the bed, stripped her gloves. She was aware that her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, not from any of the obvious causes, but from the specific neurological cost of holding your hands at a precise angle under controlled conditions for 11 minutes while other systems were running in overdrive. She'd shaken like this before. She knew what it meant and what it didn't mean. The taller escort had finished his calls. He was looking at her with the focused attention of someone who had a lot to say and was arranging it in the right order. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Specialist Vance Durall, DoD Special Operations Liaison. The man you just stabilized is Admiral Varden Kessler, and the operation he was returning from when he was attacked is still classified at a level I can't discuss in an open room." Mara said nothing. "The Admiral asked you by operational designation," Durall continued, "which means whatever you told everyone here about who you are, that's done now. People are going to want answers." From the doorway, Rowe's voice came in like something falling on a hard floor. "What designation?" Durall glanced at him. "Sir, I'm going to need everyone without clearance to... I'm the attending physician of record for this patient." Rowe's voice had recovered its temperature, but not its certainty. Something in it was different, tighter maybe, or less easy. I have a right to know what just happened in my trauma bay and who performed an unauthorized procedure on my patient. Unauthorized, Mara said, very quietly. Ro turned toward her. The procedure that kept him alive, she said. You want to call that unauthorized? You entered a restricted trauma bay without invitation, violated my direct instruction to leave, and performed an intervention that wasn't sanctioned by the attending. Your patient had 6 minutes, she said. Maybe. The intervention I used isn't in the standard protocols for your department because it was developed in field conditions that don't exist in your training record. She looked at him steadily. Not with anger. Anger would have required a different emotional register than what she was running right now. He's alive. You can do whatever paperwork makes sense to you. Dural had his phone out again. Dr. Rowe, I have to ask you to step outside. This is now an active DoD security situation, and civilian medical personnel, without clearance, need to— She's civilian medical personnel, Rowe said, pointing. No, sir, Dural said. She isn't. That landed in the room like a stone dropped in water. The ripples went to every corner. Mara looked down at Kessler's face. His eyes were closed now. Not the closed eyes of unconsciousness collapsing into shutdown, but the closed eyes of someone who was exhausted and had decided the room was being handled. There was a quality to his breathing that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. A regularity. She recognized what it was because she'd heard its absence too many times to mistake it for something else. He was going to live through the night. She didn't know exactly what that would cost her. She'd been doing the math since the moment she'd heard Dural say the word she hadn't expected to hear again in this life, in this building, in these scrubs, with this name on her badge. The door behind her opened, and 3 more people came in. Different bearing, different suits, the specific posture of people who worked for agencies rather than branches. And Mara felt the room change again, reconfigure, take on a different pressure. She set down the last piece of equipment she was holding. She looked at the monitor one more time, pressure holding, rate holding, the numbers that had been trying to kill him 40 minutes ago, now running in something approaching order. He'll need imaging in 2 hours, she said to the anesthesiologist. The lateral trauma site has a secondary— She stopped, recalibrated. The anesthesiologist was nodding already, had already written something. He'll know. She turned toward the suits. Dural stepped up beside her. Miss Weston, he said, and then stopped himself. And the pause was the most information-dense moment that had happened in that room, which was saying something, because that room had been very full of information-dense moments. Or, he said, quieter, whatever name you'd like to go by right now in this room. We need somewhere we can talk. Outside the window, the rain had picked up again. Port Carver at dusk in November, going dark at 5 o'clock. The harbor lights beginning to come on in the gray distance. Mara Weston looked at the room, at Kessler, at Dural, at the suits, at Rose still standing at the edge with the chart in his hand, and his particular brand of certainty in pieces around him. And something she'd spent 4 years carefully maintaining, the distance she'd built and tended and kept, went quietly out of true. She'd known, somewhere in the specific hindbrain region where the things you don't let yourself think about get stored, that there would be a moment like this, some version of this moment. The variables had always been unknowable, the location, the patient, the specific name that would cross the specific room, but the structure of the moment, the basic architecture of it, she'd always known. You don't walk away from a life like the one she'd walked away from and stay walked away forever. Things have a way of finding you, or you have a way of finding them. All right, she said. Her voice was level. Her hands had stopped shaking. Let's talk. And in Bay 1 of Aldermore Medical Center, on a Tuesday evening in November, with the rain coming down sideways and the harbor lights going on in the distance, the woman who had been Operator Nightfall looked at the room full of people who were beginning to understand what they'd been sharing a building with for 4 years, and the careful, quiet, invisible life she'd built for herself in Port Carver, Oregon, came to its exact and irreversible end. They put her in the consultation room off the second-floor administrative corridor. Not an interrogation room, not a conference room, just the beige, low-ceilinged space where Aldermore's attending physicians met with insurance representatives and the occasional family delivering bad news about a patient's advance directives. There was a round table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with the remnants of someone's billing flowchart still visible in faded blue marker. Mara sat with her back to the wall. Old habit. She didn't think about it anymore. Dural sat across from her. The two suits from the agency. She still hadn't gotten their names, and she hadn't asked, because people who came into rooms like the one downstairs without introducing themselves usually had reasons for that. Sat at angles, one near the door, one near the window. The window one had a tablet he kept glancing at without appearing to read it. Nobody offered her coffee. She didn't want any. "How long have you been here?" Dural asked. "In Port Carver." 4 years? Under the Weston identity the whole time? Yes. He wrote something. She couldn't see what. The Admiral's team lost track of Operator Nightfall's location approximately 4 years ago. Coincidence? Not particularly. Dural looked up from his notepad. He had the kind of face that was hard to age, somewhere between 35 and 50. The ranges blurring in men who'd spent significant portions of their lives in stressful operational contexts. He looked tired in the way that wasn't about sleep. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. "The Admiral was extracted from a rendezvous point near the coast 12 hours ago. The attack happened 40 minutes before extraction, which means someone knew the schedule. Which means—" "There's a leak," Mara said. "There's a leak." The suit by the window turned his tablet over, face down, on the table. "The Admiral's extraction route and destination were known to 6 people," he said. His voice was flat and precise, the voice of someone who'd spent years reducing complicated things to their cleanest components. "We've been working on identifying the source since the attack happened. We haven't isolated it yet." "What does that have to do with me?" "The Admiral asked for you," Dural said, "specifically, by designation, in front of witnesses, which means your cover here is—" "Gone," she said. "Gone," he confirmed. He didn't say it with any particular feeling. She appreciated that. "The question of what happens next is partly why we're in this room." Mara looked at the whiteboard, at the billing flowchart, at the specific absurdity of this conversation happening in this room, in these scrubs, in this building where she'd spent 4 years learning not to be seen. "You said partly," she said. Dural leaned forward slightly. "We need to talk about the Admiral's condition, and about what you saw when you came into that room." She'd been waiting for this one. She picked her words carefully. "He presented with a penetrating chest wound, anterior entry, that your team's initial assessment misidentified as lateral based on the compression pattern. The intervention I used—" "I know what intervention you used," the window suit said. "Protocol 7 is the phrase the Admiral used. That protocol exists in exactly one operational context, and it's been classified since—" "I know when it was classified," Mara said. "I helped develop it." The room was quiet for a moment. "The medical team here will be able to stabilize him for the next 18 to 24 hours, she continued. "After that, he needs a full imaging series to assess the secondary trauma site at the T6 lateral border. I flagged it to the anesthesiologist. Whether that flag gets acted on appropriately depends on whether Dr. Rowe has been removed from the Admiral's care team," Dural said. That was faster than she'd expected. She filed it without expression. "Good. Miss Weston." Dural set down his pen. "I want to be clear about something. We're not here to debrief you. We're not here to pull you back into active status or make any claims on your time or your life. The Admiral asked for you. You responded. You did something that kept him breathing. Whatever arrangement you have with this hospital and this identity, that's not our concern right now." "Then what is your concern?" He exchanged a look with the window suit, the kind of look that had a whole conversation inside it. "The people who attacked the Admiral," the window suit said. "We believe they know where he is." The statement settled into the room the way serious things did, not loudly, but with weight, the kind that changed the pressure of the air around it. Mara looked at the window. The rain was still going. The harbor lights were fully on now, orange-yellow halos in the wet dark. "You think they'll come here?" she said. Not a question. "We think it's possible," Dural said. "The extraction route was compromised. His destination wouldn't have been in the original intelligence, but if the leak is someone with continuous access, they could have tracked the transport," she said. Yes. She was already doing the math, not the emotional math, not the part that wanted to react to what this meant for her specifically, but the operational math, the logistics, the geometry of the problem. "What's the security configuration on the building?" "We have 4 personnel on the ground floor, 2 at elevator access points, 1 outside the Admiral's room." "And the stairwells?" Dural paused. The east stairwell is being monitored by building security. Building security? Mara's voice was neutral. The night security staff at Aldermore is 2 people and a camera system that has a known lag on the northeast corridor because the server room runs hot and the processors throttle. The east stairwell camera has been on a work order for 6 weeks. She watched him absorb that. I'm not trying to make your team look bad. I'm telling you what I know about this building, the window suit said carefully. And how much do you know about this building? Mara thought about 4 years of walking the same corridors. The back routes she'd learned because the main corridors got congested at shift change. The supply points. The dead ends. The 2 basement access points that weren't on the public map because they'd been used for utilities during the last renovation and nobody had updated the emergency egress documentation. Enough, she said. She got back to the floor at 7:40 p.m. The ER had continued its Tuesday without her. One of the fundamental things about emergency medicine that she'd come to find, not comforting exactly, but stabilizing. The building kept running. The patients kept coming. The work didn't wait for anyone's personal situation to resolve. Deb found her at the medication cart within 2 minutes. Okay, Deb said, and she used the tone she reserved for things she'd been holding on to too long. I need you to understand that I am not going to pretend the last 2 hours didn't happen. There were military people in Bay 1. Roe got walked out of his own trauma bay. And you... She stopped, looked at the blood still on Mara's scrubs. You need to change. I know. And then you're going to tell me what's going on. Deb. Mara looked at her. Deb Ferris had been the first person at Aldermore to learn her name. Not just Weston, her actual first name, Mara, which she'd used on her ID but which most attendings called her by last name, only because that was the culture of the floor. Deb had learned it in the first week and used it every time since, which was a small thing that had meant more than Mara had allowed herself to acknowledge at the time. I can't tell you much. Can you tell me you're okay? Mara thought about the question seriously. It deserved that. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in 24 hours. Deb studied her face with the particular attention of someone who'd watched a person carefully for 4 years and understood more about that person than the person had ever intended to reveal. All right, she said finally. Go change. Your Bay 2 patient is ready for discharge and there's a PEDS case coming in that Torres can't handle alone. Mara went and changed. She was back on the floor by 8 o'clock, running her board, and she'd gotten 3 hours into the rest of the shift before Roe reappeared. He wasn't in scrubs. He'd changed into street clothes, dark jacket, his hospital ID still on its lanyard, hanging slightly wrong. And he came to the nurse's station with the specific energy of a man who had spent 3 hours recalibrating his understanding of a situation and arrived at conclusions he wasn't at peace with. Weston. He stood at the edge of the station. She was charting. She looked up. I need to understand what happened in that room. I explained it at the time. You explained the medical procedure, he said. I'm asking about the other part. You're asking about the designation. I'm asking about who the hell you actually are. The station was quiet for a Tuesday at 8 p.m. One other nurse across the room, an orderly at the far end, Torres somewhere in the back doing paperwork. Not private, not exactly, but not crowded. Mara looked at Roe. He was angry, which she'd expected, and underneath the anger there was something else that she'd also expected. Not quite humility, not quite enough for that, but the beginning of the thing that precedes humility, when a person has witnessed something that doesn't fit their established model and hasn't yet decided what to do with that. I'm a nurse, she said. I have been a nurse. Whatever else I was before, that's not something I'm able to discuss. The military people are handling what they need to handle. She looked back at her chart. The patient is stable. That's the outcome that matters. You made me look incompetent. She put down her pen, looked at him directly. Dr. Rowe, your patient had a wound pattern that wasn't in any of your training because it came out of an operational theater that has no civilian medical analog. You didn't miss something you should have caught. You missed something that almost nobody would have caught. She paused. What you did in that room after I entered, telling me to leave, repeating it, that part is on you, but the assessment error is not. He stared at her for a long moment. Why are you telling me that? Because it's true, she said, and because being angry about the wrong thing wastes time. and time is the one resource that actually matters in this building. He left without saying anything else. She watched him go and then turned back to her chart and did not examine what she was feeling about that conversation because there wasn't any useful information in it. Not right now. At 11:15, Dural appeared in the corridor near the supply alcove. He'd been upstairs most of the evening. She'd tracked it peripherally, the way she tracked everything in this building, the way she'd been doing it for 4 years without meaning to. She'd known where the military personnel were at most points during the last 6 hours without actively looking for them, which was its own kind of information about the habits she'd never actually lost. "We have a problem," he said. She stepped into the alcove. "What kind?" "Intel came in 20 minutes ago. There's activity on a monitored channel, coded, but our people broke the surface layer fast enough to get the gist." He kept his voice low. Not quiet, because he was nervous, but quiet because the situation required it, which was different. "Someone knows the Admiral is here. Not the city. The building." Mara processed that. The extraction transport. Probably. GPS could have been tagged before the convoy left the pickup point. He ran a hand across the back of his neck. "We're contacting Portland for additional support, but ETA is minimum 2 hours, probably closer to 3. 2 to 3 hours was not a number she liked. "How many are you expecting?" "Unknown, minimum 2, based on prior pattern. Could be more." He looked at her. "I know you've been out of active status for 4 years. I'm not asking you to show me your current personnel positions," she said. He pulled out his phone. "A building schematic. Not Aldermore's public map. Something more detailed. The kind of detail you pulled from construction filings." She looked at the marked positions of his team. "Your northwest stairwell is open," she said, "and the basement access from the utility corridor." She pointed. "That's not on this map, but it connects to the east maintenance bay. If someone did a structural survey on this building, which anyone planning an approach would do, they know that access point exists. Can you show me?" She looked at the schematic for another 3 seconds. At the building she'd walked every day for 4 years. At the access points and the camera blind spots and the supply routes and the 12 things she'd noticed without meaning to, because noticing things was apparently something that didn't stop just because you'd asked it to. "Yes," she said. The next 40 minutes were the kind of controlled preparation that looked, to anyone watching, like very little. A nurse and a federal agent moving through a hospital at late shift, which hospitals were full of. But Mara moved through the building with Dural 2 steps behind her, and she named things as they went. The utility corridor access, the camera lag on the northeast angle, the emergency supply staging point near the basement elevator that had never been updated into any official documentation, the 2 points in the east wing where the building's structural design created acoustic dead zones that would make approaching footsteps effectively inaudible to a stationed guard. Dural's people repositioned based on what she showed them without any visible skepticism, which she noted with something adjacent to gratitude. She'd expected pushback, the "this is our operation" energy that security personnel sometimes deployed when someone outside the chain offered operational information. She didn't get it. Either Dural had briefed his team about what she was, or they'd collectively decided that the woman who'd just saved the Admiral's life in a trauma bay knew something worth listening to. She radioed nothing, called nothing, and made no record of any of it. Her phone stayed in her scrub pocket. She was running entirely on the 4-year-old map in her head and the older instincts underneath it, and she tried not to think too carefully about the fact that those instincts, which she'd spent 4 years trying to quiet, were running clean and clear and apparently undegraded by the time she'd spent attempting to ignore them. At 12:40 a.m., she was back on the floor. At 12:53, the east stairwell door opened. She knew it before any of the alarms triggered because she was standing in the supply alcove near the 3rd-floor stairwell access. Not intentionally, she'd gone there for gauze. And she felt the pressure change that happened when a fire door opened below, which was a thing about this building she'd noticed on her 2nd week of work and never mentioned to anyone. She put down the gauze. She pulled her phone and sent a single text to the number Dural had given her. The code phrase they'd established, which was a medical shorthand that would look like a shift communication if intercepted. And then she moved. Not toward the stairwell. Away from it, toward the corridor that connected to the nursing station, because there were 2 patients in the rooms along that corridor who could not be moved quickly and who therefore needed someone between them and whatever was coming through that door. She got to the nursing station, found Torres at the desk. Torres. Her voice was level. I need you to go to the break room right now and stay there. He looked up, read something in her face. Mara, what? Break room, right now. Lock the door from inside. Do not open it until I or a federal agent with ID tells you to. He got up. He went. She'd never used that tone with him before, and apparently that was enough. She picked up the desk phone and dialed down to the security desk. 1 ring, 2, nobody answered. She didn't wait for 3. She moved to the connecting corridor and positioned herself at the junction point she'd identified 40 minutes ago during the walkthrough. The spot where a person coming from the east stairwell would have to make a decision about direction before they could see what was ahead, which meant a person positioned correctly at the junction would have 3 seconds of information advantage over whoever was moving through. 3 seconds was something. 3 seconds was how some things got decided. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights at the far end had the buzzing quality they always had at this hour. The building's electrical system doing the thing it did when the overnight load dropped and the current ran uneven. Somewhere below, muffled by 2 floors of concrete, she heard the specific sound of Dural's team moving in response to her message. She waited. The east corridor door opened. 2 of them. Moving fast but controlled, with the spacing and the pattern of people who'd done this before in other buildings. They weren't in tactical gear, wrong environment for it, wrong cover. But the way they held their bodies and the way they moved through the space told her what they were before she could see the details. They saw her at the junction point. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then the closer one, male, mid-30s, the specific build of someone who trained practically rather than aesthetically, said something in a language she recognized as a comms phrase rather than actual speech, which meant they were wired, which meant there were more people she didn't have eyes on. This floor is ICU overflow, Mara said. Her voice was the voice she used with agitated patience, not soft, not loud, calibrated. Patient rooms both sides. Anything that disrupts, move, said the closer one. She didn't. The second one reached toward his jacket. The stairwell door at the opposite end of the corridor opened, and Dural came through it with 2 of his personnel, and the next several seconds were very loud and very fast. And then they weren't, and the corridor was quiet again, except for the buzzing light and the sound of 3 people breathing too hard at once. Mara had her back against the wall. Her heart rate, which she could feel in the specific way she'd always felt it in these situations, not racing, not pounding, but elevated and precise like a second system coming online, was already dropping. On the floor of the corridor, zip-tied and separated, the 2 intruders were being secured by Dural's people with the rapid efficiency of people who had done exactly this many times before. Dural looked at Mara. She looked at him. 2, he said. You said minimum 2. I said minimum 2, she confirmed. Where are the others? She watched the specific change in Dural's expression. Not alarm exactly, but the recalibration that happens when a variable you thought you'd closed turns out to still be open. And she already knew what he was going to say before he said it. We only confirmed 2 entry points, east stairwell and front access. He was already on his radio. If there are more, the utility corridor, Mara said. She was already moving. The utility corridor basement access wasn't on Dural's building map. She'd shown him the entry point, but in the walkthrough they'd run out of time before she'd gotten to the far end. The section that connected not to the east maintenance bay, but to the older part of the building, the pre-renovation wing that was still technically Aldermore Medical Center, but which ran its own climate system on an older loop and had its own server room and its own backup communications infrastructure and its own elevator access that ran directly to the 4th floor, where the Admiral's room was. She hit the stairwell door at the end of the corridor and went down 2 floors in the time it took Dural to radio his team, and she came out in the basement utility corridor moving fast. The lights down here were motion-activated. Old sensors. There was a lag of roughly 3 seconds between entry and illumination. The corridor was lit. She stopped. The lights had already been triggered. Recently. She pressed herself against the wall and looked down the length of the corridor. 50 feet of pipes and junction boxes, and the particular smell of a building's mechanical underbelly. And at the far end, at the door that opened to the old elevator access, there was a shadow that hadn't been there when she'd done the walkthrough. Her phone was in her hand. She typed 1 line to Dural, 4th floor, old elevator, now, and put the phone away. The shadow moved. Someone was at the elevator. Someone who had done their homework on this building's layout, who had found the access that wasn't on any current map, who had either had very good intelligence or had done very patient preparatory work on the structural documentation. The elevator was going to open on the 4th floor in approximately 45 seconds. Dural's people were 2 floors up. Mara looked at the corridor, at the junction box on the wall beside her, a big gray panel she'd noticed on her first week, because the door to it had a worn latch and she'd been worried it would get pulled open by an unsupervised kid, and at the electrical schematic still half visible behind the panel door from when maintenance had last been in here. She opened the panel. She looked at the schematic for 3 seconds, which was as long as she had. Then she found the right circuit and she pulled the breaker, and every light in the old elevator access corridor in the 4th floor east wing went out. She heard, in the sudden dark, the elevator motor stop. And then, from above, she heard Dural's voice, clear, controlled, the voice of someone who had just found what they were looking for. And she heard the specific sharp sounds of a situation resolving, and then there was a long moment of nothing. Then Dural's voice again, on her phone, which had buzzed in her pocket. 4th floor is secure. We have him. A pause. There were 3. You need to come up here. Mara stood in the dark utility corridor with her hand still on the breaker panel. Her breathing was normal. Her hands were steady. The overhead motion sensor had timed out while she'd been standing still, and she was in complete dark now, the only light the faint glow of her phone screen. 3 intruders. 2 captured in the corridor upstairs. 1 stopped in an elevator she'd killed the power to, caught by Dural's team as they'd come through the 4th floor access. The Admiral was alive. The floor was secure. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, letting the dark be what it was. Just a basement corridor. Just a building she'd worked in for 4 years. Just the pipes and the junction boxes and the smell of a building doing its mechanical work through the night. Then she turned on her phone flashlight and walked to the stairwell and went up. On the 4th floor, in the chaos of personnel and secured individuals and the specific organized disorder that followed any operational resolution, she found Dural at the far end of the hall. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Relief, respect, and underneath those something more complicated that she didn't have time to examine right now. Admiral is fine, he said. Sleeping. He glanced at the door. His room is on a backup circuit. Power's still on in there. Good, she said. Mara. He said her name like he'd been deciding whether to use it. One of the 3 we detained has a DOD identification clearance, active. She looked at him. Someone on the inside, Dural said. Not just the leak. Someone who was cleared. Someone who knew the route, the destination, and apparently, he glanced down at his phone. Enough about this building's layout to find an access point that wasn't on any current documentation. Mara felt the particular cold of that settling in. Not the cold of fear, the cold of understanding something you'd rather not have understood. You need to find out who briefed them on the building, she said. Dural nodded. We're already pulling records. He looked at her. The access point they used, the utility corridor, that information. How many people would have had that? The question was careful, precise. She felt its edges. It's not on any current map, she said. It's not in any digital record I'm aware of. The only people who'd know about it, she stopped, are people who know this building extremely well, Dural said. The corridor stretched behind them. 3 patients in their rooms. 2 nurses somewhere on the floor. Torres locked in a break room 2 floors down. Deb on the early shift starting in 4 hours. 4 years of people in this building. 4 years of watching and mapping and learning without meaning to learn. Someone here told them, she said. Dural's phone buzzed. He looked at it and something in his expression shifted, tightened specifically, around the eyes in the way that meant the thing on his screen was worse than he'd expected. He turned the phone toward her. She looked at the name on the screen, and the floor she'd been standing on, not literally, but in the way that the structures you've built your life around do sometimes, suddenly and without warning, shifted underneath her. The name on the screen was Harlan Price. Mara had known Harlan Price for 3 years and 7 months. She'd known him as Aldermore's Facilities and Operations Coordinator, the man responsible for building access, maintenance schedules, contractor clearances, and the documentation of every physical system in the hospital. He was 51 years old, had worked at Aldermore for 9 years, coached a youth soccer team on weekends, and kept a framed photo of his daughters on his desk that he turned slightly toward anyone who came into his office. The way people do when the thing they're most proud of is also the thing they most want others to see. She had spoken to him maybe 40 times across the years, mostly logistics, a broken supply cart, a camera work order she'd flagged, the time she'd needed a key for the third-floor storage room after hours. I was professional, occasionally funny. Remembered her coffee order when he brought the facilities team's communal morning run, which he did every third Thursday, and which she'd never asked him about because she'd been careful, consistently, not to form the kind of relationships that asked questions. She looked at the name on Dural's screen for 4 seconds. "You're certain," she said. His keycard pulled the utility corridor access twice in the last 6 days, Dural said. Once at 2 a.m. on Sunday. Once last night at 11:40. The second time he wasn't alone, say... The badge logged a pass-through for 2 cards, but only his ID is in the system, which means the second person was using an unregistered credential. Or a cloned one. Yes. Dural put the phone away. We don't know yet if he initiated contact or if he was recruited. We don't know the timeline or what he was given. But the utility corridor access, that's not something you find by accident, and it's not something you hand over unless you know it matters. Mara thought about Harlan Price and his daughters in the photo and the coffee order she'd never asked about. She thought about the particular way people got to places like this. Not usually through ideology or mercenary calculation, at least not at the start, but through smaller things, accumulated slowly, the kinds of pressures that looked manageable until they weren't. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't change the Admiral's wound, or the 3 people in zip ties, or the elevator she'd killed the power to. But it changed the texture of the building around her, and she'd learned a long time ago to pay attention to that kind of change. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Home. We've had eyes on his location for the last hour." Dural looked at her. "We're not moving on him tonight. The priority is the Admiral's security and closing any remaining exposure. But in the morning, you'll need his access logs. All of them. Not just the key card, the contractor credential system, the maintenance request database, any shared calendar access he has with other department heads." She was already thinking through it. If he gave them the utility corridor, he may have given them other things. Building schedules, staffing patterns, shift changes. "We're aware." "I know you're aware," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." He almost smiled. It was the expression of someone who dealt with people who thought 3 moves ahead and had either learned to appreciate it or learned to tolerate it, and she couldn't tell which category Dural fell into, and it didn't matter. "Get some sleep," he said. "We have a team in position. The building is locked down as tight as we can make it tonight. There's nothing more you can do until morning." Mara looked at the corridor, at the Admiral's door, at the 2 agents now stationed where there had been one, repositioned based on the walkthrough she'd done 3 hours ago. "I know," she said. She went back downstairs. She didn't sleep. By 4 a.m., she was sitting in the break room with bad vending machine coffee and the specific tired that wasn't about hours, but about the kind of effort that ran on different fuel than physical exertion. The tired of running processes you'd mothballed for 4 years and finding them loud and demanding in a way that regular nursing work, however hard, never was. Torres appeared in the break room doorway at 4:15. He looked at her. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine." "Right." He came in and got his own vending machine coffee and sat across from her without asking if it was okay to sit. He was 28, Torres, from Tucson originally, in his 2nd year of residency at Aldermore because it was where his match had placed him, and he hadn't yet decided if he was going to stay past his residency or go back south. He was going to be a good doctor. She'd thought so for about a year and a half. "I'm not going to ask what happened," he said. "You don't want to tell me, and it's probably better if I don't know." Correct on both counts. "Can I ask one thing?" She looked at him. "The patient's on the 4th floor," he said. "They're okay?" "They're okay." He nodded, drank his coffee. Didn't say anything else, which was exactly right, and she sat with that for a minute. The particular competence of someone who could read a room and respond to what was actually needed instead of what was expected, and thought again that he was going to be a good doctor. At 5:30, the early shifts started arriving. Deb came in at 5:40, already in her scrubs, and found Mara at the station. "You stayed," Deb said. "I stayed. Is it over?" Mara thought about Dural's team and the Admiral's door and Harlan Price's daughters in the photo and the morning that was going to bring things she couldn't fully map yet. Not entirely, she said. Deb looked at her for a long moment. Then, go eat something. There's food in the doctor's lounge. Somebody ordered breakfast for the overnight team and there's always leftovers. Mara went and ate something. It was the most normal thing she'd done in 12 hours, and she found, to her slight surprise, that her body was extremely grateful for it. The morning arrived with the particular quality of mornings after significant nights, a brightness that seemed slightly wrong given what had preceded it, the world continuing its mechanical processes without any acknowledgement of the machinery that had run in the dark. At 7:15, Dural found her. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, which he probably hadn't, and like he was the kind of person who functioned on that with the grim efficiency of someone who'd accepted it as an occupational condition. Price came in at 6:50, he said. We let him through the main entrance. He's at his desk. You're going to take him now? In about 20 minutes. We wanted him settled, not spooked in a parking lot. He looked at her. I need to tell you something before that happens. The name on the detained operative's DOD clearance. We ran it overnight. He doesn't work for any branch we have direct access to. The clearance is real, but the issuing authority it's getting complicated in ways that are going above my pay grade. Someone with DOD access authorized an attack on an active flag officer, Mara said. Someone with DOD access, yes, which means this isn't a standard contracted hit. This is internal to something. We don't know the full picture yet. He paused. The Admiral needs to know. He's awake. Stable, awake, asking questions that his security detail isn't cleared to answer. I think he should hear it from you. She stared at him. Why me? Because he trusts you, Dural said, and because he asked for you specifically at 6 a.m. when his detail tried to brief him on last night, and he refused to hear it from anyone else. A pause. His words were, "Get me nightfall." The Admiral's room was quiet. The monitors ran their quiet confirmation of a body working to repair itself. Pressure still careful, but trending right. The oxygen sat holding, the rate regular. He was propped up slightly, which someone had arranged because lying flat with that chest wound was not comfortable, and he was, clearly, a man who had communicated his discomfort to whoever was in the room when it happened. He looked better than he had 12 hours ago. Not good. Better. There was a difference. His eyes were open when she came in. They tracked her across the room. Sit down, he said. His voice was rough, low, the voice of a man running on medication and will. You look like you've had a worse night than me, which is saying something. She sat. You've been briefed on the incident. I've been told there were 3 of them, and they're in custody. He looked at her steadily. I've also been told you're the one who figured out the building access point before my own security team did, which is either impressive or deeply embarrassing, depending on how you look at it. The team performed well, she said. The access point wasn't in their documentation. But it was in yours. He watched her. You've been mapping this building. I've been working in this building for 4 years. It happens. He was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped. Outside, the November morning had delivered actual daylight for the first time in 3 days. Thin and silver, but present. I never approved your extraction from the program, he said. I know. The authorization came from above my level. I didn't know where they'd put you until... He stopped. Breathed through something. I'm sorry it took a gunshot wound for me to find you. Mara looked at him. At the Admiral who had known her in a different life, in a different context, in rooms where neither of them had looked anything like what they looked like now. The distance between those rooms and this one was enormous in every way she could measure, and sitting with it was uncomfortable in the way that true things sometimes were. Don't apologize, she said. You're using oxygen I'd rather you save. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. There she is. He closed his eyes for a second, opened them. Dural told me there's a complication with the clearance. Yes. How bad? She thought about how to calibrate this. He was stable but not robust, and the stress of what she was about to tell him would run a cost on his system. She'd seen patients decompensate after difficult news, the physiological response to certain kinds of information as real and measurable as any traumatic injury. But he was also a flag officer with 30 years of decisions behind him, and he was asking a direct question and giving him a managed version of the truth because she'd decided it was better for him was exactly the kind of thing he would not forgive. The detained operative has a legitimate DoD clearance issued through a channel we haven't identified yet, she said. Dural's team is working up the chain. The implications are that this isn't an external contract. This is an authorized operation from inside the system. Someone with access sanctioned the attempt. Kessler's jaw set. She watched it. The specific hardening of a person receiving information they'd suspected but hadn't confirmed. The way the body responds to the closing of uncertainty, even when the closed version is the bad one. I've been carrying an investigation that touches some significant institutional interests, he said. Have been for 14 months. The people who would benefit most from me not completing it have always been internal. Yes, she said. And now they know I'm alive. Yes. He looked at the ceiling, breathed, came back. What's the security assessment on this location? Compromised. Not critically, not immediately. The 3 from last night are in custody, and whoever's running this operation will know the location attempt failed, but staying here past today is a bad idea, he said. A bad idea, she confirmed. Dural's people are working a transfer protocol? Since about 3 a.m. He closed his eyes. Not in the way of someone losing consciousness, but in the way of someone who needed 2 seconds to process and had the discipline to make it exactly 2 seconds and no more. When he opened them again, his expression had the quality of a man who had made a series of decisions while his eyes were closed. There's a name, he said. Someone at DoD. Someone who would have had access to my extraction route, my operational schedule, and the resources to place an operative with valid credentials inside a contracted hit team. He looked at her. I need to get that name to someone outside my normal chain. Because your normal chain is potentially compromised. Possibly. I don't know how far up it goes. His hand moved on the blanket, a controlled gesture, like he was reaching for something that wasn't there. The investigation I've been running, the documentation is secured, not on any system, physical records, specific location. But if I can't get to them and the people who want this buried know I'm still alive, they'll move on the records, Mara said. Within the next 12 to 24 hours? Probably. He looked at her. I need someone I can trust to move them. You have Dural. Dural's chain goes through the same DoD structure that's potentially compromised. I can't use him for this, not without knowing where the leak originates. His eyes were steady on her face. The expression of someone who understood exactly what they were asking and was asking anyway. I know this isn't what you came back for. I know what you've built here. Don't, she said. Mara, don't frame it as a favor, she said. That's not what this is. She looked at him, at the monitor, at the thin November light. Tell me where the records are. She didn't tell Dural right away. She needed 30 minutes first, to think through the geometry of the problem, the clearance question, the chain of trust issue the Admiral had laid out. Dural was competent and she trusted his operational instincts. She didn't know who he reported to, and right now that gap mattered. At 8:40 a.m., Harlan Price was detained at his desk in the facility's office by 2 of Dural's people and a federal agent who had arrived from the Portland field office at 7:50. She heard about it secondhand, through Deb, who heard it from an orderly who'd been walking past the facility's corridor at the wrong moment. By 9 a.m., it was moving through the hospital in the particular way that significant events moved through hospitals, in fragments, in misattributed versions, in the specific speculation of a building full of people who process stress by talking about it. She was working her board, deliberately, methodically, because the ER didn't stop for any of this, and because the work was a kind of structure she needed right now, and because she'd been doing it for 4 years, and the muscle memory of it was, in this specific morning, something she was grateful for. At 9:20, Rowe found her in the corridor outside Bay 3. He looked like he'd slept badly and thought harder than was comfortable. He'd changed back into his scrubs. His ID badge was straight this time. The facilities manager, he said. They're saying it's connected to last night. I can't discuss that. You can't discuss... He stopped. Recalibrated. Started differently. The hospital board was called this morning. Emergency session. Aldermore's administrator, Phelps. He's been fielding calls from the federal people since 6 a.m., apparently. He looked at her. Someone told him that a civilian nurse initiated tactical response in his hospital last night without authorization. Mara finished the notation she was making on her chart. Someone did. They're talking about your employment status. She looked up. My, Phelps. He's... Rose stopped again. His jaw moved slightly. There's talk about the protocol violations. The unauthorized entry into Bay 1. What happened last night doesn't fall into any category his liability framework covers, and he's trying to find a way to manage his exposure. She held very still. He's going to suspend me, she said. Not a question. Roe looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. It wasn't sympathy. It was more complicated than that, and less comfortable. The expression of a man who had watched something happen that he couldn't quite square with what he thought he believed. I think so, yes, he said. I think by this afternoon. She absorbed that. The specific quiet of it. The way the system she'd worked inside for 4 years was processing what she'd done last night and arriving at a conclusion that made institutional sense even as it defied every other kind. Okay, she said. That's all you're going to say? What else is there to say, Dr. Rowe? He looked at her for a moment, then, I was wrong yesterday, in the trauma bay, when I told you to leave. The words came out like things he'd been carrying and needed to put down somewhere. You were right, and I was wrong, and I handled it badly. I want you to know I know that. Mara looked at him. 4 years of his particular brand of dismissal laid behind that sentence. The name used as punctuation, the not looking at her when he spoke, the coffee cup and the chart, and the continuous assumption of hierarchy that had nothing to do with competence and everything to do with credential. Thank you, she said. She meant it. It wasn't sufficient, but it was real, and real was better than sufficient right now. She went back to work. At Leventon, everything accelerated. The call came from Dural to her cell while she was in the supply alcove. Short, stripped down, the DoD clearance on the detained operative had traced back to a specific authorization chain, and the person at the top of that chain had just flagged themselves by attempting to access a classified communications server from a location that shouldn't have had that access, which meant they'd either panicked or weren't aware the breach had been detected, either of which told Dural's supervisors something they needed to know. They're moving fast, Dural said, which means we need to move faster. A pause. The Admiral told me about the physical records. He told me this morning, after you left. He also told me why he'd asked you first. Another pause, shorter. I'm not offended. I didn't think you would be. The location he gave you and the location he gave me, did they match? Yes. Good. Then we're coordinating on this, and I need you to understand that I've already cleared my chain through a separate channel that bypasses the compromised nodes. This isn't just me. There are 4 other agencies that want those records, and they've been waiting for 14 months for the Admiral to be in a position to access them safely. She could hear his voice shifting into the tone of someone assembling things quickly and not sure about all the pieces yet. There's a courier team in position. But the building where the records are kept, it's not military, it's civilian, it's in Port Carver, and the security on it is civilian. Where? He gave her the address. She recognized it. It was the Aldermore Medical Center Annex building, the old administrative wing 3 blocks from the main hospital, used for record storage and administrative overflow, which the hospital had been trying to sell for 4 years and hadn't, which meant it was still technically Aldermore medical property, which meant it fell under the facilities management system, which fell under Harlan Price. Price knows that building, she said immediately. He may have given them access. I know. That's why we need to get there first. A pause. There's something else. The 3 we detained last night. We've been running interrogation since 5 a.m. One of them is talking. He's been in position in this area for 3 weeks, longer than the attack timeline, which means they weren't just here for the hit, Mara said. No, Dural said. They were here because someone told them about you, 3 weeks ago, before the attack. Someone told them that a person in this hospital might be connected to the Admiral's operation, and they were watching the building. His voice was careful, precise, carrying the weight of what he was saying without dramatizing it. You were already a target, Mara. The Admiral coming here wasn't what put you on their radar. You were on their radar before he arrived. She stood in the supply alcove with that. 3 weeks. She'd been watched for 3 weeks and hadn't known, which meant whatever she'd thought she'd built here, the invisibility, the careful, quiet life, had been more porous than she knew, or someone had given her up longer ago than last night, or both. "Who knew about my identity?" she asked. "Before last night." "That's the question we're working on." He sounded tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. "Right now we need to move on the annex building. Can you get there?" She looked at the corridor, at the board with her patients' names on it, at the shift running around her, the building that had been her structure for 4 years. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. She found Deb at the station. "I need to leave," she said. "I know the shift." "Go," Deb said. She didn't ask why. She looked at Mara with the expression of someone who'd been paying attention for a long time and had stopped needing the details. "I'll cover your board." Mara went. The annex building was a 4-story brick structure that had been built in 1987 and had the specific institutional aesthetic of buildings designed in that era: functional, unbeautiful, the kind of building that blended into its surroundings by being entirely unremarkable. She'd walked past it dozens of times in 4 years. She'd never been inside. She got there at 11:32. Durrell's courier team was a block away, staged but not visible. She had her earpiece in, Durrell's frequency, low-grade civilian hardware that wouldn't draw attention. And she walked in through the main entrance the way anyone with legitimate business walked into a building, which was the only way to do it in daylight on a public street. The lobby was unstaffed. The reception desk had a call-ahead buzzer system and a security camera that was positioned to cover the desk, not the stairwell access. She took the stairs. Second floor was administrative storage. Third floor was inactive records, boxes, filing systems, the accumulated paper record of a hospital's operations going back decades. She was looking for the 4th floor, specific room, specific unit, which the Admiral had described with the precision of someone who had made very sure they were giving directions that couldn't be misremembered. She came out of the stairwell on the 4th floor and stopped. The corridor was not empty. There was a man she'd never seen before at the far end, near the door the Admiral had described. He was facing away from her, working at something on the door frame. Not a lock, not a standard access mechanism, something smaller, and she recognized it after 2 seconds because she'd seen its type before in operational context that had nothing to do with a civilian records building. A signal blocker. I was installing a signal blocker on the door, which meant he wasn't there to retrieve the records. He was there to prevent anyone from calling out once they were inside the room, which meant he was expecting someone to come for the records, which meant the information the 3 detainees had given up in interrogation included this location, and whoever was running this operation had decided to wait rather than retrieve, to use the records as bait, which was a much more sophisticated play than she'd been expecting, and it changed the geometry of everything. She'd walked in through the front door. She took a step back toward the stairwell door, and her foot caught the threshold strip, the worn metal edge of the stairwell entrance. And it made a sound, small but distinct, the kind of sound that a quiet corridor carried further than it should. The man at the far end of the corridor turned. He looked at her. She looked at him. In her ear, Durrell's voice came through. "Mara, we've got movement on the east exterior. There are 2 more approaching the building's rear access. Armed, they must have—" She pulled out her earpiece. She needed to think without the noise. The man in the corridor was already moving toward her, and she had 3 seconds of open stairwell behind her, and 4 years of a life she'd chosen, and the quiet she'd built, and the name on the ID badge that wasn't her name, and somewhere in the Admiral's room 3 blocks away, a man who was alive because she'd walked through a door she wasn't supposed to walk through, and she made a decision in the space between 1 second and the next. That wasn't really a decision at all, but the recognition of something she'd known since the moment she'd heard the Admiral say a name she'd spent 4 years not answering to. She didn't go back through the stairwell door. She went forward. The man in the corridor pulled a sidearm and said, "Stop!" She didn't stop. She closed the distance at an angle he hadn't calculated for. Not straight, not aggressive, a specific angled approach that changed his sightline problem and his geometry problem simultaneously. And she was inside his arm reach before the calculation corrected. And the next several seconds were fast and not clean, and she hit the wall once hard enough to see a brief white edge at the periphery of her vision. And then she was on the right side of the situation, and he wasn't. She had his radio. His sidearm was at the end of the corridor. Her shoulder was going to hurt tomorrow. She could already feel the damage accumulating in the specific way that damage accumulates when you're running on adrenaline. Not hurting yet, but leaving markers, little flags that said, "This will matter later." She found the door the Admiral had described. She found what was inside it. The records were physical, actual paper files, printed documents, the kind of evidence that could not be remotely wiped and could not be denied once in the open. She took them. All of them. She found the carry bag she'd been told would be there, which was the piece of this that had always required trust, and she put the files in it and she went back to the corridor. In her earpiece, which she'd put back in, Durrell's voice was controlled and urgent. "Rear access breached, 2nd floor. They're coming up. Mara, where are you?" "4th floor," she said. "I have the package. There's a man down in the corridor. He's secured, not seriously injured." She was already moving back to the stairwell. "What's your team's position?" "East exterior, 30 seconds from the main entrance." "Don't come through the main entrance," she said. "The lobby camera is offline. I noticed the indicator light on the way up. They may have cut it before they sent him in. If they have eyes on the exterior and they see your people moving, alternate access." She thought about the building, the same way she thought about every building she spent more than 10 minutes in. The layout, the geometry, the points of intersection. 3 blocks from Aldermore. She'd walked past it for 4 years. She'd also seen the loading access on the alley side, the dock that the annex used for records transport. She'd noticed it because it was the same alley she cut through on nights when the parking structure filled early and she needed to come in from the side street. She gave Durrell the alley access description in 7 words. "I'm coming out the front," she said. "Walk time, not run time. If there are people watching the exterior, a running nurse is more visible than a walking one. You want to walk out of there. I want to not get shot on a public street," she said. "Give me 90 seconds." She went down the stairs with the carry bag over her shoulder and walked through the lobby and out the main door of the annex building into the thin November daylight. And she turned left on the sidewalk and walked toward Aldermore at exactly the pace of someone who was between tasks on a workday. And she counted her breaths and kept her eyes forward and did not look behind her. At the corner, Durrell materialized beside her. He matched her pace without breaking stride. "You have it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have it." He looked at the bag, then at her. "You're bleeding." She looked down. The wall apparently had done more than leave markers. Her left arm at the elbow, she'd torn the sleeve of her scrubs and there was a laceration she'd missed in the adrenaline. Not deep, not dangerous, but real and inconvenient. "I'll deal with it," she said. "You literally work in a hospital." "I'm aware." She kept walking. "What's the status on the building?" "Teams in position. The 2 on the rear access were detained before they made the 2nd floor. We're running clean." He paused. "For now." She looked at him sideways. "For now." "The authorization chain we traced this morning," he said carefully. "The person at the top of it. We've had confirmation of their identity for the last 40 minutes. He looked ahead. Down the street toward the gray morning and the Aldermore building 3 blocks away. "Mara. It's a name the Admiral is going to recognize." "How badly?" "Badly enough that when he hears it, everything he's been building for 14 months is going to land differently than he expected." Durrell's voice was professional, calibrated, but underneath it she could hear what it cost him to say the next part. "And when this goes public, and it will go public, the records you're carrying make it inevitable. It's going to be the kind of thing that moves fast, very fast. And everyone connected to this building, this case, this operation," he glanced at her, "is going to be visible in a way that can't be managed." Mara walked. The November air was cold and direct, the kind of cold that comes in off the Pacific and doesn't negotiate. She felt the shoulder she'd hit the wall with. She felt the elbow. She felt the weight of the carry bag and the specific gravity of what was inside it. "Who is it?" she said. Durrell said the name. She stopped walking. 1 beat, 2. The city moved around her. A car passing, a gull somewhere above the buildings, the distant sound of the harbor. She started walking again. "Does the Admiral know yet?" she asked. "No," Durrell said. "I was going to tell him when I had the records secured. Now that you have them, he needs to hear it," she said, "before anyone else acts on it. He's been running this investigation for 14 months, and he deserves to be the one who closes it, not the one it gets delivered to." "Agreed," Durrell said. "Can you be there when I tell him?" She thought about Kessler's face. The Admiral who'd asked for her by a name she'd buried. The man who'd pointed at her in a trauma bay and undone 4 years of careful invisibility with a single word. "Yes," she said. They turned the corner toward Aldermore, and they were half a block away when Mara's phone buzzed. Not Dural's line, her regular hospital line. She looked at the screen. It was an internal call from Aldermore's administrative extension. She answered it. "Miss Weston." It was Phelps, the hospital administrator. His voice had the quality of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now delivering it in a context that no longer fit the rehearsal. "I need to inform you that pending review of last night's incident and the protocol concerns that have been raised, your access credentials have been suspended effective immediately. Please return your ID badge to—" She lowered the phone, looked at Dural, looked at the bag in her hand, at the records inside it that were, in their own way, the kind of thing that ended and began things simultaneously, that closed doors and opened others, that settled questions and raised them, that put people's feet on different ground than they'd been standing on yesterday. "They suspended me," she said. Dural's expression moved through something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite disbelief, but lived in the territory between them. While I was walking out of a building with federal evidence that's been missing for 14 months, yes." She put the phone back in her pocket. Perfect timing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened his mouth to say something, and then both their phones went off simultaneously, and the expression on Dural's face changed in a way that made Mara's stomach drop before she'd even looked at her screen. The specific change of a person receiving information that rewrites the immediate future in real time. "What?" she said. He turned his phone toward her. It was a message from his team lead on the 4th floor of the annex building. Short, urgent, stripped of everything except what was necessary. It read, "He wasn't alone. There's a 4th. We don't have eyes on him. He went out a window. He has a copy of the location he was supposed to signal to. He'll have made contact by now." Mara looked at the message. At the building 3 blocks away where Kessler was lying in a monitored room with a healing chest wound and the kind of exhaustion that accumulated in men who'd been running long operations under sustained pressure. "He'll go for the Admiral," she said. She was already running. She covered 3 blocks in under 2 minutes. Not sprinting. Sprinting on a public street drew the wrong kind of attention, and she needed the 30 seconds it cost her to think, which was the kind of calculation she hadn't had to make in 4 years, and which came back with the same automatic quality as everything else that had returned in the last 18 hours. Dural was behind her, on his radio, repositioning his team from the annex to Aldermore. She could hear him talking, but she wasn't processing the words because she was doing other math, the 4th operative, the window exit, the time elapsed since the message arrived, the distance from the annex building to the hospital, the access points she'd spent last night closing, and the ones she hadn't thought to close because she hadn't known there was a 4th. She came through Aldermore's main entrance at a walk and went straight to the elevator. The lobby guard, a different man from the overnight shift, younger, sitting straighter because the last 12 hours had clearly communicated to everyone in this building that the standards of the night before were no longer adequate, looked at her badge out of habit and then stopped. Because her badge said suspended in the system now, she could see it in the brief confusion on his face. "Ma'am, federal operation," she said, not stopping. "Check with Specialist Dural." She took the elevator to the 4th floor. Dural's 2 agents were outside Kessler's room where she'd left them. She clocked them from the elevator doors, both upright, both present, neither showing the specific physical language of a situation that had already escalated. She let herself breathe fractionally. "Anyone come through?" she asked the closer one. "Negative. We've had no approach." She looked at the corridor. Both ends. The stairwell doors at either end. The room across from the Admiral's that was being used for storage. The supply alcove mid-corridor. "He hasn't come yet," she said, "or he's already here." She looked at the storage room. She crossed to it in 4 steps and opened the door. Empty. Boxes, a folded wheelchair, IV stand, the smell of a room that wasn't regularly occupied. She stood in the doorway and looked at the window. Intact, latched, no sign of recent approach from outside. She turned back, looked at the supply alcove. The stairwell door, which had an internal indicator light she'd noticed during the overnight walkthrough, green when latched, which it was. Green didn't mean nothing had come through it. It meant it was latched now. She crossed to the stairwell and opened it and looked down. Clear. She looked up. Clear. She went back into the corridor and pulled out her phone and called Dural, who was still in transit. I don't have eyes on the fourth operative, she said. The floor looks clean, but I'm not confident. Where are your people on the building exterior? 2 on the ground level, 1 just reached the east exterior. He was breathing harder than normal, moving. What do you need? Eyes on the roof access, she said. And on the 3rd floor connecting corridor to the east wing, there's a maintenance bridge between the old and new buildings. It's not on your schematic. It connects at the 3rd floor and has ladder access to the 4th floor exterior ledge. A pause. Don't ask me how I know. Moving someone to the roof now, he said. Mara, stay with the Admiral. She went back to Kessler's room. He was awake. He'd been awake since she'd left, apparently, because he had the look of a man who'd been lying in a hospital bed running operational calculations and finding the exercise inadequate. Sit down, she said, which was what he'd said to her when she'd walked in the first time. And something in his face almost moved toward amusement before it registered that she was using the tone she reserved for situations that hadn't resolved. What happened? He asked. There were 4, not 3. The 4th is loose. She came to the window and looked down at the street, then stepped back from the glass because standing at a window you couldn't control was a habit she'd spent years training out of other people. Dural's team is covering the exterior access points. His ETA is 3 minutes. And until then? Until then, I'm here. She moved to the chair beside his bed, not because she was calm, but because sitting was tactically better than standing in a room with a window you'd just stepped away from. The records are with Dural's courier. They're secured. Kessler absorbed that with the expression of someone receiving information they've wanted for a long time and finding that the receipt is less clean than the wanting. Good, he said. His voice was careful. He also needs to tell me something. Dural. I was vague when he came by earlier, and I've been thinking about what kind of information produces that specific kind of vague. He'll tell you when he gets here. Tell me now. She looked at him, at the Admiral in the bed with the monitor running its quiet confirmation beside him, and 14 months of operational work, and a chest wound and a body working to repair itself, asking her for a name. Deputy Director Callum Strand, she said. The room was very quiet. Kessler's face did the thing she'd expected. Not surprise, not quite, but the specific settling of a person who'd been carrying a suspicion they couldn't prove and had just been handed the proof. The kind of settlement that had weight to it, that pressed down rather than relieved. Strand, he said. Not a question, just the name, held for a moment. Yes. 14 months, he said. I had 6 people on the short list. Strand was on it. He was quiet for 3 seconds. He was my primary contact for the investigations oversight committee, which means he knew the scope, the timeline, and the status of your findings, which means he knew I was close. Kessler's jaw set in the way she'd seen it set the night before. He'd have had access to my extraction schedule through the oversight channel. He'd have had the authorization capability to insert a credentialed operative into a contracted team. He exhaled. Something that wasn't quite controlled but was close. He was at my confirmation hearing 17 years ago. We shook hands. Mara said nothing. There wasn't anything useful to say to that. The specific human cost of institutional betrayal, which was different from other kinds of betrayal because it came with the particular damage of misplaced trust that had been deliberately manufactured. Strand had presumably spent 17 years being the kind of person whose hand Kessler would shake, which was its own kind of operation, longer and more patient than anything that happened in a building with guns. The records, Kessler said. What's in them ends this. Yes. And Strand knows they've been retrieved. Probably within the last 20 minutes. His people at the annex building would have communicated the failure. She looked at him. Which means he's making decisions right now about exposure management. He'll run, Kessler said. Or he'll try one more move, she said. The stairwell door at the far end of the corridor made a sound. She was on her feet before the sentence was fully processed, moving to the room door, and she was in the corridor in 2 seconds. The 2 agents were already repositioning, the closer one moving toward the stairwell door with his hand at his side. The door opened. Dural came through it. She let herself breathe. Behind him was a second agent she hadn't seen before, and behind that agent was a woman in civilian clothes with a federal ID on a lanyard and the bearing of someone who didn't work field operations but was in one now, because the situation had escalated past the point where desk classifications held. "Building's clear," Dural said immediately, reading her expression. "The fourth operative tried the maintenance bridge access. My team on the roof had him before he made the ledge. He looked like he'd been running, which he had been, and like something had resolved in the last 3 minutes that had been unresolved before. We have all 4. She went back into the Admiral's room. Dural followed. The conversation that happened in that room over the next 40 minutes was the kind Mara had spent 4 years not being in. The operational debriefing, the chain of custody confirmation for the records, the secure line call that Dural made to an agency she'd never directly worked with, the careful and methodical process of converting 14 months of a single Admiral's investigation into something that existed in multiple copies in multiple secure locations and could no longer be erased by any single person's access to any single system. Kessler talked through it with the steady precision of a man who'd spent 14 months preparing for this exact conversation and hadn't expected to be having it from a hospital bed. He was tired in a way that went deeper than the wound, the kind of tired that accumulated in people who'd been carrying something significant and alone for a long time. But his thinking was clear, his memory was precise. When Dural's colleague asked questions, he answered them in the right order, in the right level of detail, without editorializing and without the tendency some people had in these situations to over-explain or under-deliver. Mara sat in the corner and said very little. At some point she noticed the carry bag was no longer in her hand. She'd given it to Dural in the corridor and hadn't marked the exact moment, which was fine. That was the right place for it. And her hands were resting in her lap, and her elbow was still bleeding slowly, which she kept forgetting about and kept being reminded of when she moved a certain way. At the 40-minute mark, Dural stepped out to take a call. He came back with an expression that was doing several things at once: relief, satisfaction, and the particular sobriety of someone who'd gotten what they were working toward and was already processing what it meant. Strand's travel credentials were flagged at 11:40 a.m., he said. He tried to board a private flight at Reagan National. He's in federal custody. Kessler closed his eyes. Not distress. Release. The specific physiological response of a body that's been running on a threat signal for a long time and has just received the information that the threat is contained. "And the investigation?" he asked, eyes still closed. "The records are being processed now. There are 3 independent review bodies that have already been briefed on the chain of custody. What you built over 14 months, Dural paused. It's going to hold, Admiral. It's documented, it's sourced, and it's now in enough hands that no single action can suppress it. Kessler opened his eyes. He looked at Mara. "You should have been at the table for that conversation," he said, "not in the corner." "I was fine where I was." "You're bleeding on my hospital furniture." "I'll have someone look at it." He kept looking at her with the expression she'd been avoiding engaging with directly since she'd walked into this room. The specific look of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to say it to a person who deflected the categories that most people use to receive these things. "You saved my life twice in 12 hours, he said. "The second time was more of a group effort." "Mara." She looked at him. "What do you want to do?" he said. "Not what's been decided for you, not what the situation required. When this is over, what do you want?" It was the question she hadn't asked herself since Port Carver, since 4 years ago, since the life she'd put down and the life she'd built in place of it. She'd been so focused on the structure of each day, the next patient, the next shift, the careful architecture of a quiet life, that the question of want had become almost theoretical. She thought about Deb covering her board, about Torres in the break room following an instruction he'd trusted without understanding it, about the 7-year-old girl who was more interested in the color of the suture thread than in crying, about the 4 years of a building she knew in the dark, every camera lag and structural quirk and forgotten utility corridor. "I want to go back to work," she said. Kessler looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Dural. "Is that going to be a problem?" Dural's face was doing something careful. "The administrator suspended her credentials this morning, before the situation at the annex resolved." "He suspended her credentials," Kessler repeated. "Correct." The Admiral reached for the call button on his bed rail. The standard nurse call button, the same one every patient in every room in this hospital had access to. "Get me whoever's in charge of this hospital," he said, not to anyone in particular. "Not whoever's managing their public communications, The actual person in charge. He looked at Mara. If you'll permit it. She thought about Phelps and his liability framework, and the call that had come in while she was walking out of the annex building with evidence in her hand. She thought about 4 years of the particular working conditions of a person the institution had never fully seen. Go ahead, she said. What followed was not instantaneous, and it was not clean, and it did not look in the middle of it like a process that was going in the right direction. Hospital administrators did not respond well to pressure from any direction, which Mara understood, because their entire professional function was managing intersecting categories of institutional risk, and anything that pushed from outside the normal channels registered as threat before it registered as information. Phelps arrived in the Admiral's room at 1:15 p.m., looking like a man who'd been having a very bad day since approximately 6 a.m. and was now being informed that his day had a new dimension. He was a small man, Phelps, compact and precise, with the kind of institutional tidiness that communicated competence without necessarily delivering it. He'd been Aldermore's administrator for 6 years. She'd spoken to him perhaps 3 times in passing, and he'd never initiated contact with her once. He looked at the Admiral. He looked at Dural. He looked at Mara. She watched him process the arithmetic: a federal operation, 4 detained operatives, evidence transport, an admiral in his hospital who was clearly not a passive figure in whatever this was, and she watched him arrive at the conclusion that the calculus he'd run at 7 a.m. that morning had been based on incomplete information. Ms. Weston's suspension, Dural said, without preamble. We're going to need that reversed, today. The protocol concerns that were raised in a context that your administrative review didn't have full information about, Dural said. His voice was professional and not unkind and left no room for redirection. The actions Ms. Weston took in this building over the last 18 hours were materially integral to a federal operation. Any formal disciplinary action based on last night's events would need to account for that context. Phelps looked at Mara again. She didn't say anything. She'd learned a long time ago that the most powerful position in a room was often the one that said the least when everyone else was saying things. The unauthorized entry into the trauma bay, Phelps said. Not an argument exactly. More like a man testing whether the ground was as unstable as it felt. Saved my life, Kessler said from the bed. His voice was flat and clear and left approximately no room for a different interpretation. Phelps was quiet for several seconds. I'll need to review the circumstances formally, he said. There are board procedures. Of course, Dural said. We'll provide full documentation of the federal operation scope and Ms. Weston's role in it. The review should be straightforward. It wasn't a threat. It was a roadmap. And Phelps understood roadmaps. He looked at Mara one more time, and this look was different from the others, had something in it that the previous 3 had not, which was the specific discomfort of a person recognizing that they've made an institutional decision based on a framework that no longer applied. Your credentials will be reinstated pending formal review, he said. He left. Mara looked at Dural. That was handled. You did everything else, he said. I can manage an administrator. By 3 p.m., the shape of things had begun to clarify. Strand's arrest had moved through the relevant channels fast. Faster than these things usually moved, which was itself information about how many people in those channels had been waiting for exactly this to happen and had been unable to act without the documentation that 14 months of a single admiral's investigation had now provided. The 3 operatives from the overnight detention were being processed through federal custody in Portland. Harlan Price had been transferred out of Port Carver to a federal holding facility, which meant the investigation into his recruitment and cooperation was running somewhere Mara didn't have visibility into and didn't need. She'd had her elbow looked at, 4 stitches, a bandage, delivered by an ER nurse named Ferris, who said nothing during the procedure, and then said, when she was taping the bandage, "You couldn't have done this in the break room? You had to do it in a federal situation?" "It wasn't planned," Mara said. "Nothing about last night was planned," Deb said. "Doesn't mean it didn't happen." She pressed the tape down with more precision than was strictly necessary. "Torres wants to know if you're okay. He's been asking every 20 minutes. I've been giving him non-answers because I didn't actually know. Tell him I'm okay." "Are you?" Mara thought about the question. She'd been thinking about questions seriously lately. giving them the weight they deserved instead of the quick redirect she'd been defaulting to for 4 years. "I think so," she said. "Ask me tomorrow." "I asked you that yesterday, and you said the same thing." "Tomorrow's a different tomorrow." Deb looked at her for a moment, not the look of someone unconvinced, but the look of someone deciding to accept the answer that had been offered. "Fine. Go eat something again. You look like you haven't since this morning." She went and ate something. It was 3:30 in the afternoon, and she was sitting in the doctor's lounge with a sandwich. She wasn't entirely tasting when Dural came in and sat across from her with the expression of someone who had one more thing to say and was deciding how to say it. "The formal documentation of your role in the operation," he said. "It's going to be thorough. It has to be, for the federal record." He paused. "That means your identity, the previous one, the operational history, is going to be part of a record that, while classified at the relevant levels, exists. It can't be fully sealed the way it was before." She'd known this was coming. She'd known it since the moment the Admiral said her name in the trauma bay. "I understand," she said. "There are options. Regarding relocation, new placement, alternative. I told the Admiral what I want," she said. He looked at her. "You want to stay here?" "I want to go back to work," she said. "Here. At this hospital, on this floor, doing the job I've been doing." She picked up the sandwich. "Whatever my name is now. Whatever the record looks like. I want to go back to work." Dural was quiet for a moment. She had the impression of a man recalibrating not his position, but his understanding of someone else's. "Okay," he said. He said it simply, without qualification, which was the right way to say it. She ate her sandwich. He sat with her without the need to fill the silence, which was a quality she hadn't expected from him and found she was grateful for. At 4 p.m. her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, a Washington prefix which narrowed it down to approximately 40,000 possibilities. She answered it. The voice on the other end identified itself, and the identification took her a moment to fully process, because the person calling was not someone she'd expected to hear from, not in this context, not today. And the call's content was brief and specific and left her sitting in the doctor's lounge after it ended with her phone in her hand and an expression she couldn't have described if asked. Dural looked at her. "Who was that?" "The Secretary of Defense," she said. He blinked. "What did he want?" She put the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at Dural. "He wants to make a formal request," she said. "Not an order. A request." She paused. "He wants to offer me the directorship of a new medical operations integration program that the DoD has been trying to launch for 3 years and couldn't staff appropriately because—" She stopped. Started differently. "They've been trying to find someone who could bridge clinical field medicine and operational planning at the flag officer level. Apparently the Admiral has been recommending a specific candidate for the role since the program was first proposed." Dural was very still. "He recommended you?" "Without telling me," she said. 14 months ago, when the program was first proposed." She looked at the phone. "Before he knew where I was." The doctor's lounge was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, Aldermore Medical continued its afternoon. The ER board running, the shifts turning, the building doing its unchanging work of receiving people at their worst and trying to return them to something better. She thought about the Admiral who'd pointed at her across a trauma bay, about a name she'd buried and a life she'd built, and the 4 years of careful, invisible work she'd done in a building she now knew better than its own facilities coordinator had. She thought about the program, what it would mean, what it would require, what it would ask of her that she hadn't been asked to give since she'd left. And she thought about Deb's hands pressing bandage tape with more precision than necessary, and Torres asking every 20 minutes if she was okay, and the 7-year-old girl who was more interested in the color of the suture thread than in crying. The phone sat on the table. She didn't reach for it yet. "Tell me about the program," she said to Dural. He leaned forward. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," she said. "Start at the beginning." He started talking. She listened with the attention she gave to everything that mattered, fully, without reservation, and outside the lounge window. The November afternoon was doing the thing it occasionally did in Port Carver, when the clouds broke late and the light came in low and gold off the Pacific and landed on the buildings and the harbor and the city she'd chosen 4 years ago for reasons she'd kept to herself. She hadn't been wrong about Port Carver. She'd just been wrong about what she was going to be while she was here. At 4:45, Durrell's phone buzzed. He looked at it. He went still in the way she'd learned to read over the last 24 hours. Not alarm, but the recalibration that preceded new information. He turned the phone toward her. It was a message from the Portland field office, forwarded through the federal chain from the facility where Strand was being held. It read, "Subject has requested to make a statement. Claims operational exposure extends beyond current indictment. Says there are 2 additional figures in the oversight chain who were aware of the Kessler operation. Names provided. One of them is currently active, holding a position with access to the operation's ongoing review." Mara read it twice. "Someone who's still inside," she said. "Someone who's still inside," Durrell confirmed. "Someone who, as of right now, doesn't know we have the names." He looked at her. "Which gives us a window, short one." She put down the last of her sandwich, looked at the phone, looked at Durrell. The window on the doctor's lounge showed the harbor going golden in the late afternoon light. And inside the hospital, the work continued. And in a room on the 4th floor, an Admiral was recovering from the wound that had brought all of this to a head. And the program the Secretary of Defense had described would begin, formally, officially, with whatever name she decided to carry forward, in 6 weeks. None of that, at this specific moment, was the most pressing thing in the room. "How short?" she asked. Durrell was already on his feet. "Short enough," he said, "that we needed to have already started." They moved in the next 4 minutes, which was what the window allowed. Durrell made 2 calls in the elevator, one to the Portland field office confirming receipt of the names, one to a contact Mara didn't know at an agency she didn't need to know, the kind of call that was mostly listening on his end and very few words on the other. She stood beside him and thought about the structure of the problem. 1 name already in custody, 2 additional figures, one of them currently active and holding access to the review process, neither of them yet aware that Strand had given them up. The elevator opened on the 4th floor and Durrell ended his second call. "The active one," she said. "What access do they have?" "Review committee for the Admiral's investigation. They're not operational. They don't have field resources the way Strand did. But they have visibility into the documentation process, which means they can potentially flag what's being filed, what's being prioritized, what gets passed up the chain versus what gets held at the committee level. So they can slow the process. Or redirect it. Bury specific findings in procedural review. Request clarifications that extend the timeline past the point where the political window closes." He looked at her. "These things don't always end with someone in handcuffs. Sometimes they end with a filing that takes 18 months and lands in a committee that's changed personnel twice, and the urgency has diffused." "Not this time," she said. "No," he said. "Not this time." The reason was in the carry bag that was now in a Portland federal facility in 3 independent copies. The physical records that Kessler had spent 14 months building that documented not just the specific operational misconduct that had targeted him, but the broader pattern of institutional decisions that had enabled it. The kind of documentation that was the opposite of diffusible, the kind that, once processed, existed in enough forms and enough places that no single committee's delay could make it disappear. What the active figure could still do was complicate the attribution, muddy the specific chain of authorization, introduce ambiguity about which signatures corresponded to which decisions, make the record's conclusions subject to enough competing interpretation that the clearest findings got buried in the noise. Mara understood bureaucratic damage the same way she understood wound patterns. The location and character of it told you what was actually being protected. "The name Strand gave," she said. "The active one. What's their specific role on the committee?" Durrell looked at her. "Documentation intake and classification authority." She thought about that for 2 seconds. "They can reclassify incoming materials, elevate the classification level on specific filings so they move into a review channel with a longer timeline." "Yes." "Then the window isn't about getting to them before they run," she said. "It's about getting the documentation processed past the intake stage before they know to reclassify it." Durrell was already pulling his phone back out. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize over the last day as his version of being surprised. It was subtle, more a quality of attention than a visible reaction, but she could read it now. "You're right," he said. He was already dialing. "Give me 3 minutes." She waited in the corridor outside the Admiral's room while he made the call. Through the door, she could hear the monitors running their quiet confirmation. She looked at the window at the end of the hall. The harbor, the last of the afternoon light, November doing its minimal best. The call took 4 minutes, not 3. When Admiral lowered the phone, his expression had the quality of something settled. "The primary documentation package cleared intake 17 minutes ago," he said. "Before Strand's statement, before the names were passed up. It's already in the formal review pipeline, past classification authority, already assigned to the independent review body." He paused. The active figures window just closed. She let out a breath. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief was clean, and this wasn't clean. It was the complicated release of something that had been running at pressure for 24 hours, the specific letdown of a body that had been making decisions about what mattered and what could wait, and was now getting the first signal that the emergency tier had passed. "They'll still bring them in," she said. "They'll still bring them in," he confirmed. "But it's over in terms of what they can do to the investigation." He looked at her steadily. "It's over, Mara." She looked at the door, at the room behind it where a man was healing from a wound that should have killed him. "Almost," she said. She went back in. Kessler was awake, which she'd expected, and he'd been awake long enough to have arrived at a version of what had just been communicated to him through his security detail, which she could tell from the particular quality of stillness he had when she came through the door. Not the stillness of a man waiting for news, but the stillness of a man who'd already received it and was deciding what to do with it. "Documentation cleared intake," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "Durrell's team lead told me 5 minutes ago." His voice was more substantial than it had been this morning. Still rough, still running on significant pharmacological assistance, but fuller. More like the voice of the person underneath the patient. "Strand is talking. Strand is talking. The second name, the committee figure. They've been taken in. Within the last 20 minutes, yes." He was quiet for a moment. The monitor maintained its steady commentary beside him. The afternoon light through the window had shifted from gold toward the flat gray that preceded Port Carver's early November dark. "It's done," he said. Not triumphant, not relieved in any simple sense. He said it the way people said things they'd been trying to make true for a long time, with the weight of the time it had taken, which didn't vanish just because the outcome had arrived. "The formal process still runs," she said. "Hearings, legal proceedings, the independent review." "I know. I've done this before. The formal process takes what it takes." He looked at her. "But the part that could be stopped, the part that was working against it, that's done." "Yes." He was quiet again. She sat in the chair she'd been sitting in, the one beside his bed that she'd been returning to across the course of the day. The way people returned to places that had become, through repeated use, the correct place to be in a given situation. "The program," he said. "The secretary called you." "He did." "What did you decide?" She thought about how to answer that. She'd been sitting with the question across the last several hours, not avoiding it, not deferring it, just letting it exist alongside everything else that was existing, which was sometimes the only way to let a decision arrive in the right form. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "I'm going to." "But you're leaning." "I'm leaning," she confirmed. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Good," he said. "That's enough." He looked at the window, at the gray light. "I'm going to recommend to the formal review that your operational record be fully reinstated and publicly acknowledged. Not the classified portions, those stay where they are, but the service itself, the fact of it. You've been carrying work that nobody knew you did, and that's going to change." She felt the weight of that differently than she'd have expected. She thought she'd feel some resistance to it. The reflex of 4 years of careful invisibility, the habit of not being seen. What she actually felt was something quieter and more complicated, something that had to do with the specific human cost of being unseen, not by choice, but by institutional erasure, and the different weight of being seen because it was true. "Okay," she said. "That's all? What else is there?" He made the sound that was almost a laugh again. It was better than it had been this morning. "Nothing, I suppose." He looked at her. You should go home. You've been on shift since yesterday, and you're running on approximately no sleep, and you have 4 stitches in your elbow." "I know," she said. She didn't move immediately. "Mara." She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. It was simple, and it was direct, and it had the specific weight of something said by a person who didn't say it unless they meant it exactly. She held it for a moment. Let it be what it was. "Get some sleep," she said. "Your pressure is still running cautious, and you're going to need another imaging series tomorrow." "I know," he said. She got up, went to the door, stopped once without turning back. "Admiral?" She paused. "I'm glad you made it." She went home. She slept for 10 hours, which was unusual. She rarely slept past 6, regardless of what time she went under. And she woke at 7 a.m. to the specific quality of morning light that arrived in Port Carver, when the clouds broke and the Pacific air came in clean, and she lay there for a few minutes in the way she almost never did, just existing in the room with the light and the sounds of the city going about its morning. She thought about the 7-year-old girl who was more interested in suture thread color than in crying. She thought about Deb pressing bandage tape with the precision of someone who cared about the person attached to the injury. She thought about the utility corridor in the dark, and the breaker panel, and the 30-year-old operational instincts that had apparently been running background maintenance on themselves for 4 years without her permission. She got up and made coffee and sat at her small kitchen table and looked at the harbor through the window. And she called the Secretary of Defense's office and accepted the directorship of the DoD Medical Operations Integration Program, effective in 6 weeks, pending the formal announcement that would be part of the broader public disclosure of the Admiral's investigation. The call took 11 minutes. When she put the phone down, her coffee was still hot. She drank it slowly, in the way of someone who had somewhere to be and was not yet late for it. 3 weeks later, Callum Strand appeared before a federal grand jury in Washington, and the testimony that followed ran for 4 days and generated enough documentation that the coverage of it ran for a week across every major outlet that had the security clearance to access the unclassified portions of what was being discussed. Mara watched none of it in real time. She was working. She'd been back on the floor at Aldermore since 48 hours after the night everything changed. Not on suspension, not under review, but reinstated in full with the specific administrative brevity that institutions deployed when they needed to correct a decision they didn't want to discuss at length. Phelps had sent an email. It had been 3 sentences. She'd returned to her board. The floor had changed in the way that floors changed after significant events. Not dramatically, not in ways that were easy to name, but in the texture of interactions. Torres stopped asking whether she was okay and started asking her actual clinical questions, the kind that weren't deferential but were collaborative, 2 people thinking through something together. The attendings who'd previously treated her as atmospheric consulted her with a directness that acknowledged what they'd observed without requiring any of them to name it. The young nurses who'd arrived in the months before the incident began orienting themselves by her position in the room, using her as a reference point the way junior personnel used people who knew where the real information lived. Roe came to find her on her 3rd day back. He stood at the edge of the nurses' station. She looked up. "I've been asked to provide a statement to the hospital board's formal review," he said, "about the events in Bay 1, about the protocol concerns that were raised." "I know," she said. "Durrell's team contacted me about it." "I want you to know what I'm going to say." He paused. "I'm going to say you were right and I was wrong, and the outcome of that room was the outcome it was because you were in it." He held her gaze. He was uncomfortable in the way of someone saying something that was true and that cost them something to say. "I'm also going to say that the culture of this department, the way we've structured authority and expertise and who gets heard, that's something I've been thinking about. I don't have a finished thought on it yet, but I'm thinking about it." She looked at him, at the man she'd spent 4 years navigating around, not with resentment, but with the practical economy of a person who'd learned which walls to not waste effort on. The wall had moved. It hadn't vanished. People didn't vanish their accumulated assumptions overnight, and she didn't expect them to, but it had moved, and movement was different from nothing. "That's worth something," she said. "I hope so." He paused. "For what it's worth, you were a better nurse than I gave you credit for. A better clinician. I see that now." Another pause. "I should have seen it before." She thought about the 4 years. About the charts flagged and the BP cuffs not swapped and the diagnoses noted quietly in system fields where they'd be found when the evidence arrived. About the invisible accumulation of work done well by someone who'd learned not to need it, acknowledged. Start seeing it in the people who are still invisible, she said, not just in me. He looked at her for a moment, nodded once, walked away. She went back to her chart. The public announcement of the DoD Medical Operations Integration Program Directorship came in the second week of December as part of a broader release of information from the ongoing federal proceedings. The release was detailed and deliberately public, which was a choice that had been made at levels above any individual's preference, and which served the specific purpose of making what had happened, and what was being corrected, part of the institutional record in a form that couldn't be quietly revised later. Her name was in it. Her full name. Not the operational designation, not a clearance level, but her name and her role in a brief factual accounting of what her service had been before Port Carver and what it had become during the period when everyone who'd worked beside her had known her only as a competent, quiet ER nurse who wore navy scrubs and kept an off-center ponytail and held a pen in her left pocket, though she was right-handed. Deb found her in the break room with the article on her phone. Someone had sent it to the hospital group chat, apparently, because people at Aldermore did things like that. And Deb sat down across from her without saying anything for a moment. Then, "Why navy scrubs?" Mara looked at her. "They show blood less dramatically." Deb looked at the ceiling, looked back. 4 years, she said. "You were here for 4 years?" "Yes." "And the whole time I was a nurse," Mara said. "That part was true." Deb was quiet. The break room refrigerator hummed. Outside, December in Port Carver was running cold and clear, one of those winter days when the clouds lifted and the air had an edge that felt like actual weather, rather than the city's usual ambient gray. "Are you leaving?" Deb asked. "The program. It's in Washington, I assume." "Mostly," Mara said. "The operational integration component has field sites. One of them is a medical center in the Pacific Northwest that will be used for clinical training integration." She paused. "There are conversations happening about which facility." Deb looked at her. "Are you telling me?" "I'm telling you there are conversations," Mara said. "I don't want to overstate it." "Right." Deb pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was holding something in. "Right. Okay, that's very measured of you." She stood up. "Torres is going to cry." "Torres is not going to cry." "Torres is absolutely going to cry." She picked up her coffee. "I will deny having this conversation if anyone asks." She left. Mara sat in the break room for another few minutes with her own coffee and the December light and the specific quiet of a morning that wasn't emergency, wasn't urgency, wasn't anything except what it was. On a Thursday in the third week of December, Admiral Varden Kessler was discharged from Aldermore Medical Center. He walked out under his own power, which his care team had considered optimistic 3 weeks ago and which had turned out to be exactly correct. He was a stubborn patient in the specific way of people who recovered through will as much as biology, which was something Mara had observed before, and people who'd spent long careers making decisions that required them to believe in their own continued presence. He was met in the main lobby by 2 of Dural's personnel and a driver. He walked slowly, which was appropriate, and he was upright, which was not nothing. Mara was at the nurse's station when he came through the main corridor. He stopped. He looked at her across the lobby. She was charting. She looked up and saw him, and she put her pen down. He said, carrying across the lobby in the voice of a man who didn't lower it for audiences. "For the record, this hospital has one of the best trauma nurses I've ever encountered. I've encountered quite a few." The lobby was not empty. There were people at the reception desk, a family in the seating area, 2 orderlies near the elevator, Deb somewhere to Mara's left making a sound that was not quite covered by the ambient noise. Mara looked at him across the lobby. "Get some sleep on the plane," she said. "Your pressure was still running cautious at your last check." He smiled. It was a real one, the kind that changed the whole face. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked out. She picked up her pen and went back to her chart. What she understood now, that she hadn't let herself understand while she was building the quiet life, was that hiding a thing doesn't diminish it. You can lay it down, cover it, walk away from it so deliberately that you almost believe it's gone. And it will still be exactly what it was, waiting in the dark, patient in the way that true things were patient. It doesn't leave because you decided it should. It waits because it's yours. She'd thought the life she'd built at Aldermore was separate from the life she'd left. A clean break, a different room, a different self. But she'd been mapping every building she entered. She'd been tracking camera lags and structural quirks and forgotten utility corridors. She'd been flagging diagnoses in quiet chart fields and catching the patterns. Other people missed and holding every room she walked into with the specific comprehensive attention of someone who'd learned that the detail you overlooked was the one that mattered. She'd thought she was hiding. She'd actually been practicing. There was something in that, not comfort exactly, but something more durable than comfort. The recognition that the things we've done that shaped us don't disappear when we stop naming them. That the skills we built through hard years of difficult work don't evaporate in a quiet studio apartment in a coastal city where nobody knows what we used to be. That you can stop performing a thing completely and it will still be there, ready when the moment asks for it. She'd spent 4 years being invisible, and the invisibility had served a purpose she hadn't fully understood at the time. It had given her a building, a floor, a city, a set of people she knew quietly and who knew her in return, and it had given her 4 years of a different kind of work that was its own kind of real, that had its own weight, that had mattered in its own way to the people who'd been on the receiving end of it. None of those 4 years were wasted. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before November, before a Tuesday evening with the rain coming sideways and a wounded man pointing across a trauma bay at the wrong person, at the right person, at the only person he trusted. She was still a nurse. She was going to remain a nurse, in the program, in the integration, in whatever form the work took as it moved forward. That part wasn't strategic. It was simply the most honest thing she knew about herself. The people who'd dismissed that, who'd looked at the woman with the off-center ponytail and the navy scrubs and seen background furniture, who'd said her name like the name of an object, who'd treated her competence as the ceiling of her significance. Those people were now contending with the specific discomfort of having been wrong in a way that couldn't be quietly revised. Some of them would learn from it. Some of them wouldn't. That wasn't hers to manage. What was hers was the chart in front of her, the board with her patients' names on it, the floor she'd walked for 4 years, and the floor she'd walk tomorrow, and the work that had always been real whether or not anyone had been paying attention. In December, in Port Carver, with the harbor going silver in the morning light, and the ER opening its doors to another day of people who needed someone to be present and competent and genuinely paying attention, Mara Weston picked up her pen and went to work and was not invisible. She had never needed to be anything else.